Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Just bear with us as we allow everybody into the waiting room. From the waiting room. Great. Thank you all for joining us. This is the program on education policy and governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. If I could introduce you to the moderator for our series, Katharina Werner, our postdoctoral research fellow for this year. Katharina?
Thank you, Antonio. Welcome also from my side for the final installment of our PEPG Spring Colloquium Series. We're very excited today for the finale, if you want, to have Rajashri Chakrabarti as a speaker. So let me quickly introduce her. So Raji will be talking about getting ahead by spending more, local community response to state merit aid programs. And she is a vice president of the research group and a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Her areas of interest include labor economics and consumer finance, but also economics of education. And within this, her research focuses on education investment decisions, so future financial and economic outcomes, financial literacy, and also returns to post-secondary education and educational finance, which we'll hear more about today. So prior to joining the New York Fed, Raji was also a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University in the John F. Kennedy School of Government's program on education policy and governance, where we hosted today. And she also holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. So with all that said, Raji, we're very excited to have you with us today. We have an hour. So please, we'll start with some of your commands for everybody in the audience. If you have any clarification questions, feel free to post those in the chat, and then we will have a discussion after Raji's talk. So Raji, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katerina, and thank you so much, Paul and Antonio, to all of you for having me. This is really so wonderful to be back here. It's really a homecoming. And thank you for having me here. So I'm trying to share my deck, and I'm going to go to full screen mode. Hopefully you'll see it in just a second. Okay, great. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about local government response to state merit aid programs. And this is joint work with Nicole Gorton, who used to be an RA, and she is now a graduate student at UCLA, and Joydeep Roy. So I am going to first do some motivation before jumping into the topic. So the state merit aid programs have been actually in place for quite some time. The first one was in 1991 in the state of Arkansas. And after that, 27 states so far have instituted these state merit aid programs. Excuse me, sorry about that. I should have muted it before. So basically, the state merit aid programs are scholarships that are available to students who attain certain benchmarks in high schools. Typically, these are B- or so. It does depend on the state, and they do not depend on family income. So they're completely independent of family income. It's conditional on in-state enrollment. So I cannot take the money and go out of state and enroll in an out-of-state college. I have to enroll in an in-state college. It can be either public or private. The fellowships are actually much more generous if I'm going to a public college, less if I'm going to private colleges, although again, there are lots of heterogeneity across states. And the renewal of these scholarships are really contingent on I'm doing satisfactory progress throughout my college life. So let's say if I get a C, C-, I will no longer be eligible for this merit aid programs. And these are actually, these merit aid programs lead to large declines in net tuition expenses of students. In some cases, they actually pay ultimately zero because the full tuition is covered by the state merit aid programs. In other cases, a large part of the tuition is covered, but not fully. Regardless, it is always the case that students do face a large decline in their net tuition expenses. So what are the objectives of these state-mandated programs? The stated objectives are that they aim at increasing post-secondary enrollment. And they also seek to enroll people or enroll students rather in higher quality colleges. That's also one of the stated objectives. And they also aim to keep an educated student body back in the state for an educated or more educated, I should say, workforce in the state. And definitely they promote and reward academic achievement. So there is actually a pretty big literature that already exists before us. I'm actually not going to go through it in details, given that we have an hour. I definitely am very happy to answer any questions that you might have. The major strands of literature relating to the state-mandated programs actually relate to literature that have looked at college enrollment, persistence. There is a mixed picture. The earlier studies typically show large increases in persistence and completion, which to some extent is not found in newer studies that actually use different methods. There are also studies that look at college quality, and again, there are differences in kind of results. Again, I'm happy to go into them in more detail if there are questions. There's literature that actually looks at whether or not there has been migration patterns or duty-based programs, whether or not the states have been successful in stemming brain drain and keep students in state compared to before. And the answer to that is yes, to some extent, but it's a very, very small effect. There is one paper that documents effects on high school outcomes. So high schoolers, when they know that they might be actually eligible for merit aid, they try to actually do better. And there has been GPA increases that has been documented by this paper that you see there. There are papers that have linked state data to long-term labor market data. That's the Bettinger paper. And then the other paper, the Scott Clayton and Zafar paper, link it to credit market outcomes to try to understand if students who are eligible for these scholarships, they actually do better in terms of either labor market outcomes or credit market outcomes in terms of, let's say, paying back debt and such. And the very short answer to this is yes. So if they are actually eligible for these various scholarship programs, they do better in life later. So what do we do, or where do we differ from this existing literature? So we actually are looking at something that has not been looked at in the literature so far, spillovers to K-12 education. So far the literature has looked at effects on merit programs on higher ed itself. Here, what we are going to do is try to see whether or not there are unanticipated effects on K-12 education. Just because a state might actually institute a merited programs, do we see any kind of spillover effects, any kind of unanticipated effects on K-12 education funding? And that's the subject matter of this paper. And why might we think that even could happen? What are the mechanisms? So one might think that with the merited programs coming into effect, state funding for higher education might go up. And if you think that the total budget for education is more or less constant, then you might think that K-12 education funding would be crowded out. This is an empirical question, and we are going to look at it empirically. And then if it is the case, let's say that local government funding that's coming from state does get crowded out, is there a response from the local government? Is it the case that school district increase the taxes or increase the local revenue to some extent compensate for any declines in state funding? So that's the other side or the other angle that this paper is going to look at. And moving on, if there aren't any questions, so what we are going to look at, or we are going to leverage, is really across time and across state variation in the implementation of these merit aid programs. So what you see in this map is kind of a really a hierarchy in terms of when the state merit aid programs were instituted across states. The states that are completely white have not instituted any state merit aid program as of today. The lighter color, the lightest color, yellow, I should say, are the early states. So the first state was Arkansas, 1991. That was the first merit aid program that came into effect. That was followed by Georgia in 1993 and so on. And the latest state was in 2006, and that was Wyoming. So the point of this map is to show you that there is quite a bit of both cross-sectional and temporal variation in how the merit aid programs got instituted. And that's what we are going to exploit in two strategies. The first one is going to be a very simple difference in differences strategy, the simplest that you can actually imagine. The focus of this paper will be a synthetic control strategy, which I will go into in a lot of detail, and happy to actually take questions at that time, and I'll just move on from here. So the data that we are going to use are going to be both on district and district funding, as well as county level and state level funding, and the source is going to be F33 school finance surveys that come from NCES. And we will have data from 1989-90 school year till the 2010-11 school year. The higher ed funding is going to come from the State Higher Education Executive Office, that's the SHIO. And the years that we have data from them are 1999 through 2010. We have a bunch of state level controls as well as sources, and we have population and racial breakdown, as well as median income, unemployment. We also have district level controls. They come from NCES. I think pretty much all of you are very familiar with those data. And then we also use some nominal variables that we will be adjusting to real terms to make them comparable, and we are going to use CPI from the BLS to do actually just that. So some summary stats before I move into the empirical method. So here you see merit aids, the states that actually instituted merit aid programs. I'll call them the merit states, and states that have not instituted merit aid program. As of now, they're called this non-merit aid states or non-merit states. If you look at state revenue per student and you compare those between the two states, and you actually see that merit states actually have higher state revenue per student. And again, if you actually look at local revenue per student, it's the opposite. They actually have lower local revenue per student compared to non-merit states. So seems like there is a compensatory relationship even without any merit aid programs. It's kind of a baseline you can think of. When you think of property tax revenue per student, that's also slightly lower in merit states compared to non-merit states. They go pretty hand to hand with local revenue. Total revenue per student are very similar between these two types of states. So basically means like the composition of the revenue as you kind of divide between state and local, they are different, whereas the total revenue quite similar across these two types of states. Then we actually are looking at the higher ed state funding or higher ed state appropriations. And you see here that the merit states actually even before had slightly higher ed funding than the non-merit states. And so there definitely are some differences. They're not huge. Some of these are statistically different from each other, like the higher ed funding. But there definitely are differences that you can see, which may not be for exogenous reasons. And that's where our strategy will come in. When you look at the demographic composition in these states, there also are differences. The merit states are more likely to be have a higher share of Black and Hispanic populations, or generally minority populations, whereas the non-merit states have a higher share of white residents. If you are looking at total population, you also can see that merit states are actually bigger than non-merit states. In terms of median income, they are relatively more wealthy. And next, I think the next stop kind of looks at district level enrollment and the composition of students. You kind of see a mirroring there as well, as can be expected. If you compare to the state population share, once again, we find that they have a higher share of minority students and a lower share of white students in the merit states. So we are going to start with a very simple diff and diff estimation strategy, and we're going to exploit the fact that these programs were instituted at different times in different states, and we are going to exploit 1989 through 2010. That's the data set. We actually went considerably further, and I'll tell you why we decided for the main analysis to be cut at 2010. And I actually can say right now, and it might come up later as well, we did not want to look at very far away from the state mandated programs. And the reason is that as you go further and further away, there may be other programs, other changes that in terms of policies, in terms of perception changes that might happen, that makes causal interpretation harder. So we will do it in multiple ways. We'll show you many more years and then we will cut it. So just to be relatively closer to the programs, so to make sure that we do better in terms of causal analysis. So here the YIST, the left-hand side variable, denotes outcome variable that can be state aid per student, local revenue per student, total revenue per student for a certain district I in state S in year T. The merit dummy, it varies at the state time level. So think of a state that, let's say, instituted this program in 2000, let's say. So we will see that state both before as well as after. So this merit dummy does vary by time as well. So that's why you see a subscript S and T there. We also will have district fixed effects and year fixed effects. And we have a pretty rich set of both state and district level controls. In terms of a clustering of the standard error, we actually are going to follow Amy Finkelstein in her paper, a pretty old paper in QJ of 2007, where she recommends that the clustering be done at the market level. So we think of the market level either at a county, as a county or district. So most of the results are going to be at the county level. I should assure you that the results remain very similar in terms of statistical significance as well. If we do district level clustering or even state level clustering, as you might imagine with state level clustering, the standard errors do blow up, but our results do remain the same. So this is again showing you results from the diff and diff and trying to see whether because of merited programs, there were changes in higher ed funding. That's what you are seeing here. What you can see is that, yes, the answer is yes, there were, and we are showing this in 3 different ways. The first column does not have any controls. The second one has a bunch of state level controls, and the third one will have a lot of state as well as district level controls. The estimates do not budge much as we put in more and more controls. You see that about a 3%. So I should say that every table that you see will have a final row which will give you the percent effects, and they are expressed as a share of the sample average of that same variable. So you actually see there is a 3% increase in state funding for higher education, which boils down to about 325 per student that happens after or as a result of the Medicaid programs. So then the question is, are there effects on K-12 education? And that's what we're looking at in this specific table. The first panel of this table is looking at effects on state revenue per student. And you indeed see that there is a negative effect on state revenue per student at the K-12 level. So there might be some sort of a total budget that's more or less fixed at the education budget. So when there is an increase in higher ed funding rather, you do see a decline in K-12 state funding. It's not a very small decline. It's about a 5% decline in K-12 state funding that you can see. And then we try to see whether or not there is some sort of a compensatory relationship, whether or not local revenue per student responds, and the answer is yes. You do see an increase in local revenue per student, but it does not compensate the whole of the decline in state revenue per student. So there is almost a 3% increase in local revenue per student, but if you look at total revenue per student, which is really the last column or last row, I should say, statistically, it isn't the case that we see a decline. It seems like in terms of magnitude, there is a very small decline that we see here. So as I said, the main strategy that we are going to use in this paper is the synthetic control strategy. And this is based on seminal work by Abadi and co-authors. The papers that you see there being referred, those are the papers that we will be basing this analysis from, and the strategy is very much taken from those papers. So what do we do here? What we will do is that for each outcome variable and for each treated state, we are going to find a synthetic control state. And how do we do that? We find for each outcome variable and for each treated state, we will find a weighted combination of control states that will minimize the pre-program root mean squared prediction error. And once we do that, the weighted combination of states that actually accomplishes that, the minimization of RMSP, that is going to be the synthetic control. And the synthetic control is created based on a variety of pre-treatment characteristics that we will be using as matching variables. And these are the values of the dependent variable in each of the pre-treatment years, as well as average of state level demographic variables. And we were going to use the synthetic control state to forecast the path of the outcome variable in the post period, or the post program, or the post paid program period. And any difference between the path of the treated states, the actual path of the treated state, and its synthetic control will be called the treatment effect. So just to be a little bit more, I think I have a picture coming up in 2 slides that will make it hopefully more clear, and I'll go over it. But just to kind of chalk out the path ahead, what we are going to do is that we are first going to see or look at state-specific treatment effects over time. Once we have that, we are going to compile or put together the state-specific average treatment effects. Then we will show you the overall average treatment effects, and finally, the overall average treatment effect over time. So I think this will be more clear as we go with pictures, and I'll explain them as we go forward. So what we are doing here is taking the state of Florida. We are trying to understand the effect of merit aid programs on K-12 state revenue in Florida after the program was instituted. So the bold line, it's not really bold, but it's a continuous line, I should say, is Florida itself. You can see Florida before 97 is when Florida implemented the merit aid program. So basically the trajectory before is a trajectory of Florida state revenue per student that was before 1997. After 1997, we are again just simply using Florida data to plot state revenue per student. So the whole of the continuous line simply plots Florida's state revenue per student, starting from our first year, 1989, through our last year, 2010. That's what that line does. What is the dashed line? So for the dashed line, we create a synthetic control for Florida. How do we do that? We take Florida. We will take every state that has not instituted any merit program as of yet. We will take those states, we will use the variables that I mentioned before, which is really the pre-variable corresponding to this. So in this case, it is state revenue per student for 96, 95, 94, etc., going back to 1989. So that's one matching variable. And we are going to also use state level demographic variables. And using these, we are going to try to find a combination of these control states that would generate the closest possible match to Florida before the program was instituted. And as you can see here, we actually do quite well. The synthetic control that we actually build in this way almost completely overlaps with the Florida line before 1997. And that shows that using this strategy, we are able to find a synthetic control that mimics the path of Florida for a pretty long period, 1989 through 97, as being very similar. Then the question is, at 97, something happened to Florida. Florida implemented this merit program. The other synthetic control states did not. So the idea here is that if Florida did not have a merit aid program, Florida would follow the path of the synthetic control, which is the dashed line that you see after 97. But Florida did not follow that line. Instead, Florida followed the continuous black line that you see. So the difference between the dashed line that Florida would have followed without merit aid and the actual line, which is really the continuous line, gives us the effect of the merit aid program on Florida's state revenue per student in each of the years starting from 98 through 2010. So you see this for Florida. We repeat this exercise for every merit aid state that is there. And once for each of these states, that difference that you see captures the treatment effect for that corresponding state. And we are again repeating this and showing this, doing this exercise for another variable, which is here local revenue per student. Once again, when we do this, the synthetic control of Florida mimics extremely well Florida itself. In the pre-program period, they are, in this case, almost on top of each other. And after that, they actually diverge after a few years, and that seems like the local funding did respond. So something, just to go back one slide here, sorry, I did not go back, I went forward. So here, what you see here, I should have said, this big gap really shows that state funding per student declined in Florida compared to what we would have expected if there was no merit aid program. So this is just Florida, of course, but you do see a decline in state revenue per student that happens right after the program is implemented. And here, the local revenue response, it does take a few years, but you do see a response here. We do a similar exercise to look at effect on total revenue as well. And once again, what you see is that relatively not as well, but relatively they mimic each other in the pre-program period. And here you see that in terms of total revenue, there was a decline in total revenue in Florida after the program was instituted. And again, we are looking at total revenue per student at the K-12 level. And what we do here, as I said, we do it individually for each state. And now we are showing you for each of the merit states the effect on state revenue per student, using this analysis and really averaging over all the post-program years that are there for each state. So what do we see here? We see, I should also say that we are showing you the 95% confidence interval bands. The little bands that you see on top of the bars are the confidence interval bands, and they, in many cases, do not touch the x-axis or the horizontal axis, which means that they're actually statistically different from zero. So what we find, we are also showing you the median line, the 50th percentile, which is around $404. So that basically says 50% of the states had a decline in state revenue per student of $404 or more. That's basically what it says. And you can see that most states here actually did face declines in state revenue. There are actually 2 states that somehow actually had increases in state revenue per student. Those are Wyoming and Maryland. But apart from that, most states actually did face declines in state revenue per student. And then we also look at what happens to local revenue per student. And once again, what we are showing you is state by state for every state that instituted merited programs. And we are also showing you once again the confidence interval bands. You can see in many cases they are statistically different from zero, although not all. We are also showing you the 50th percentile line as well as the 2 quartiles, and the quartiles, the 25th percentile as well as the 75th percentile. So what you see here is that the 50th percentile is actually $60, not large, but it's still statistically significant from zero. And that basically means that 50% of the states actually had an increase in local revenue per student of $50 or more. And that basically also illustrates the compensatory relationship between state and local revenue per student at the K-12 level. Seems like as state funding is declining, the local funding is actually responding, and there is an increase in local funding. We also do the same exercise to look at total revenue per student. And here in most of the states, you actually see declines and statistically different from zero, as shown by the confidence interval bands in most cases. And what you also see is that the 50th percentile is $442 approximately. That means that 50% of the states had a decline of total revenue per student for $442 or more. So next, what we do is that instead of showing at a state level, and you saw that there were quite a bit of heterogeneities involved there, we are trying to come up with one number. So if the question is, what's the impact on state revenue per student or local revenue per student, we can tell you one number. How do we come to this one number? We do it in 3 different ways, but the results are actually quite similar. We just do an unweighted averaging of these different state revenue per student changes that you just saw. We also do another version where we weight by inverse root mean square prediction error. And the idea here is that for the states that we match the synthetic control better, so meaning like smaller RMSP, would be given more weight. because we are just matching them better. And then finally, we also do an average where we weight by base enrollment. In each of these three cases, you see that we do find that as a result of Merit programs, there are declines in state revenue per student. When we look at local revenue per student, you see an increase in local revenue per student, although it is not statistically different from zero when we are weighting by base enrollment. It is statistically different from zero in the other two methods. We also look at total revenue per student, and it seems there is a decline in total revenue per student when you do either the unweighted method or you are weighting by inverse RMSPE. We still find a decline when we are weighting by base enrollment. However, it's not statistically different from zero. In terms of the magnitudes, they're actually pretty big. I would say very big, actually. State revenue per student seems to have declined by almost 16% or 17, 18%, depending on the type of method that you like more. Local revenue did respond. Again, it varies between 5% and 9%. Total revenue declines around 4% range. So next, what we are going to do is that instead of giving you one number, which really aggregates the whole of the post-program period, we are going to really chalk out a time path and try to see whether or not this decline continued and increase, decrease, etc. So what we are here actually following the paper by Cavallo and co-authors, and we basically, I can go into more detail, but really the simplest possible way, what we are doing here is really taking the average treatment effect that I showed you for state revenue per student in each post year, average them together to look at effects 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., up to 10 years after the program was instituted. And you are looking at state revenue per student, and it shows a pretty steep decline, and that continues over years, and actually, I would say increases over years between years 1 and 10. Now, I know that you are not going to believe me if I just show you one line and you're going to tell me whether or not this line is statistically different from zero or not. So what we are going to establish is confidence intervals around that line to understand whether a treatment effect of this magnitude that you just saw in the last slide could have occurred by random chance or not. So how do we do that? So this is the way we are going to do this. So for each treated state, we are going to compute what we call placebo treatment lines. And how do we do that? For each treatment state, we look at each of the control states that went into making that synthetic control. For each of those control states, we look upon it as a placebo treatment state and constitute, or we compute its synthetic control. And that will be using the exact same procedure that we showed you. And so for each of those control states, we will find a line just like I showed you before. So we are again showing Florida. The blue line is the treated line. Each of the black lines corresponds to really a time path of each of the control states of Florida, assuming that somehow that state had a Medicaid program at the same point, which is 1997, and looking at the time path of that state. So it's kind of a placebo treatment state. And we plot those lines. The idea here is that because the other states did not really have a Medicaid program, their lines should hover relatively close to zero, which in most cases it does. There definitely are outliers. And if Florida lies outside of the band of lines, more or less outside of the band of lines, you would say that Florida is statistically different from the other lines. That's the idea. And indeed, here that seems to be the case. There are only a few, again, if you are thinking of a 5% or 10% statistical significance level. Here it is actually at even considerably less than 5% level. You do see that Florida is lying outside of the band of lines that we computed based on this placebo treated line path of the control states. And we do that for each state. So we are showing you Florida, we are showing you Louisiana, 2 Medicaid states, but we do this for every Medicaid state. There are 24 Medicaid states. So we are going to do this and have this 24 of these charts side by side. And after we do this, what we do is randomly pick a placebo line from the placebo pool of each treated state. So from Florida, we randomly pull one of those black lines. From Louisiana, we randomly pick one of those black lines. And we are going to go through all these 24 states to pick randomly a placebo line. We will average over those lines, and we are going to get an overall average placebo line. And so that gives us 1. But then we bootstrap the process to iteratively do this for many bootstrap, 1,000, 5,000, etc. And we repeat that, and we get a series of these lines, as you see, the black lines, which are really the overall average placebo lines band. And now here, what we are showing you is that the actual effect of state Medicaid programs on K-12 state revenue per student, the red line shows that, and the band of the placebo lines are the black lines. And once again, the idea is to see if it kind of lies, the red line lies relatively outside the band of the other black lines that you see, and that is the case here. And what we do, once again, following Abadi and co-authors, what we are going to try to see is whether or not this RMSP, the post-period RMSP, which is the gap that you see of the red line after, divided by the pre-period RMSP, is that an outlier? So you compute that, we compute that for the red line as well as each of the black lines. You see the black lines here, and you see the ratio for the red line here. It definitely is an outlier, and it is really lies outside the whole range of the black bars that you see. And it really shows here that state revenue per student is declining. That's what it shows. And it's statistically different from the placebo lines at a p-value of 4%, as you can see in that footnote there. We repeat that for local revenue. Once again, it is statistically different from 0, and is statistically different from the placebo lines, and it shows that local revenue does actually increase, and it does compensate the decline in state revenue. For total revenue, we do see a decline if you look at the left-hand chart, but we cannot really reject that it is different from the whole span of black lines. And in fact, the p-value there is 29%. So I guess, like, just to kind of step back and see what the results here are, and we are pretty confident of our empirical strategy, and I'm also going to think of some issues that might happen and what we have done. But what it says here is that after the Medicaid program, there has been declines in state funding per student. There has been increases in local revenue per student as a compensation mechanism. And however, the total revenue did not really come back to its original self before. Now, we do a number of checks to make sure that what we are telling you is really kind of robust to all of those things. And I'll go through them relatively quickly to basically tell you what we have done. So as you saw before, the state Medicaid program spanned a pretty long time period. So the number of post years that we see from the various states are different. So for some states, for example, Mississippi, there you actually see, we see 15 years after the program was instituted. For Wyoming, which was the last program to be instituted, we see 5 years. So there definitely is a heterogeneity, and what you might see is that we might be capturing different things. And what we do is that we do an analysis where we cap the number of years to 5 years. Every state is seen at least 5 years from the program. As you can see here, that the right-hand side really shows that effect. The other reason is that if you come relatively close to the program, you are kind of more confident that there were less of other factors that could have contaminated your strategy. So we are going to do that 5 years as well as 3 years, I believe, where the results are actually quite similar.
Let me just quickly come in with the note. So we're at 45 now, so we have a total of 15 minutes left, and I just want to use the opportunity to remind everybody in the audience to kind of, you can start putting your questions for the discussion also in the chat box now, or you can ask them later, just so everybody kind of gets prepared for that. Sorry, go ahead.
No worries, thank you. So we also look at other kind of shocks that might have happened. One is there was Hurricane Katrina that happened in Louisiana in 2005, and whether or not that could have actually affected some of the estimates. We do that by taking out Louisiana, things do not change. We also, this period will span the housing boom and bust that happens in some states. You can see them there. We take them out, but again, the results remain very similar. There was 9/11 in New York in 2001. Once again, we take out New York as well as adjacent states, and things do not really change. So that's something that we do. And as I said, because of the staggered implementation of the program, if there were things that happened exactly at the same time as the program was implemented in those specific states, then we are in trouble. But it is kind of unlikely that we have many states, or to be very specific, we have 24 states that we are doing the analysis with. For each of the 24 states, really the probability that something different at the state level is going to happen exactly at the time that the Medicaid program was implemented for each of these 24 states is something that you might imagine is not very plausible. We also, as I said, we do a 5-year window and we repeat the whole analysis. Our results actually get considerably stronger, which actually is something you might anticipate. As you come closer to the period, you are better able to capture the program effect, and you see, regardless of the method you might use, there is a decline in state funding, increases in local revenue, declines in total revenue. We also do a 3-year window to repeat this analysis. The results remain very similar. State revenue declines, local revenue increases, total revenue declines as well. That we saw before, we kind of see that same pattern here as well. Next, what we do is something called a Leave One State analysis. So what we are going to do is,
you know, Raji, we do need to have a little chance to chat. Can you wind it up, because we really do end right promptly on the hour.
Yeah, okay. If I can definitely, I cannot see the chat. Maybe there are questions, is it? So I'll just, we do, let me wrap it up in 1 or 2 minutes, Paul, is that okay?
Well, no more than that.
Okay. So we do a leave one out analysis. The results remain very similar. We also do like different things, like what their differences in party affiliations at that point of time. And we show that even in that it's basically the answer is no, it doesn't really affect. And I can again go through it much more details. I'm going to, let's see. Okay, so we do some cool things that I think maybe I can talk about. So we try to make sure that what we are identified off of is the timing. And we try to see whether or not at that specific time can be predicted by macroeconomic variables or demographic variables at the state level. And essentially, we do not really find any such effect. And this is really a strategy that we are using in this paper, potentially can be used by many other papers, because any paper that uses a strategy that exploits the implementation time could actually try to see that. This is really what we are showing, regardless of the number of variables that we put in there. The timing of the program, which is what we are identified off of, is not predicted by any of these variables. So that basically says that the timing is exogenous. We also look to see whether or not there has been breaks in macro variables, breaks in demographic variables, nothing like that. We'll try to see whether or not the share of Democratic as well as Republican governors or the state assemblies really kind of make a difference, the state legislatures. None of those things actually are things that we see. So I guess I can just wrap up. We look at effects of merit aid programs on K-12 funding. There are declines in state support for higher education or for K-12 education, which seem to be offset by local government funding, but the final total revenue is still lower than what it would have been without the merit aid program. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Paul. Maybe Paul, do you want to ask your question? And then everybody else also feel free to either type your questions in the chat, or if you would prefer, this is a meeting, so you can use your microphone and camera if you would like to ask a question directly. Paul, go ahead.
So I think you sort of answered the question I put in the chat in your wrap up, Raji, but your Florida case study, chose 1997 as the date that the merit program was put into effect. And that happened to take place when there was a transformation in Florida politics that led to all the other education innovations that took place at that time. So it sort of suggested that, this was not something that would be, sort of exogenous. It seemed more endogenous to a whole set of school policy changes that were taking place. And that led me to think, well, maybe that's happening in other states as well, because Republicans like merit pay or merit scholarships and Democrats don't. And Republicans were instituting a lot of other reforms at the time that they might have been doing that. I mean, now you say that you're not finding anything, and I didn't really get a good chance to see what kinds of data you had on that. But that was my main concern, and I know you did approach it there, but we didn't really have time to hear exactly how you had shown that.
Yeah, so why don't this is an excellent question, Paul, and we thought about this, and let me show you, because this really is a very, very good question. So because I think we can show you exactly what your question, the thing that we did. So I'm going to go to once again the full screen mode really quickly. Probably shouldn't have unshared. So here is so we are taking all the merit aid states together, and then this is just we start with the summary stats table, and it seems like 58% actually had a Republican governor, 42% Democratic governor when the state merit aid program was instituted. Then we also look at the state house. When we look at the state house, it actually shows a different pattern. So it's 46% of them had Democratic state house, 33% had Republican, 21% had split. And as we know, both the governor and the state house do matter. So we do this combination as well. And it seems like Democratic governor and state house was 25%, Republican governor and Republican state house was actually 12%. so there were variations, but I think the more important thing I would say is that we studied this in a really a regression setting. So what we are doing this here is implementation, ST, meaning like whether or not the state implemented the policy, and then we throw in dummies to represent whether the government at that point of time, was it a Republican governor?
The governor is really a critical variable in policy choices. They are the driver at the state level, even much more than in national politics. You just estimate it whether it's a Republican or Democratic governor?
Yeah, well, more. We also do legislature, and we also do this. This is the final
I think
table.
you've complicated that more than you might need to. That really, I can't see the effect of the gubernatorial chair, the shift in control of the gubernatorial chair.
So what we are doing here, Paul, is trying to see whether or not, so this is just using governors, this is just using legislatures, this is governor and legislature, and the effect on whether or not these states had merited programs, and none of these actually predict. So whatever the combination is, doesn't seem to actually predict using our whole sample, whether or not they had a merited program. And that's basically our response. And this is using the timing. So this is the timing of the merited program. Was that predicted by the governorship and legislature? The reason we thought about this as well, Paul, is because, for example, Florida is as a state. There are other states also, but because there are these 24 states that we are considering, there is variation when they were actually instituted, and it doesn't seem that the type of the governorship or the legislature predicts the timing of the program.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Do we have
Maybe
time, or are we running out? Yeah.
I think I want to squeeze in just one quick question, Raji, and then maybe if you can give a quick answer so we can wrap up on the hour. But so I was really interested to see the kind of variation of your treatment effects across states. So I was just wondering kind of how you kind of saw that, if the variation surprised you, or if you think this is implementation details of the specific merit aid programs, or would this be kind of state characteristics? I was just wondering kind of what your impression was of the variation across states.
Yeah, so there is we do not do much more than what you saw there. There is a lot of variation across states in the timing, and that is exactly what we are using here. But there are also variations in terms of the amount of the funding. It's also variations in terms of eligibility. So in some follow-up work, we're actually looking at a different paper exploiting the eligibility. But in this paper, we really just use the variation in timing. So that's what we do. So I see in the chat, Paul had another question, which is also a really good one, which in follow-up work, we are going to look at it. This paper, we really do not do anything, because what he is asking here is whether or not it translated to effects on K-12 scores or achievement. I think that's an excellent point. I do not know the answer to that question. We do not do this in this paper, but obviously that's a really excellent question, and definitely future research.
Awesome. So we're looking forward to seeing kind of results of that as it comes out. Raji, let me thank you again so much for giving us this presentation, for joining us today. Thank you also for everybody in the audience. And let me remind you that this is the last installment of our PEPG Spring Colloquium, but all of the previous talks as well will be available on the website of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. So do feel free to check out any talks that you might have missed from this semester. Antonio, any final words?
Well, thank you very much, Raji, for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you again. And you've given us a lot to chew on with this particular paper. So you might see us follow up with some emails. Well, thank you again for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again next fall.